The lonely girl. The planet was silent except for the wind that rolled across the cracked valleys and the faint sound of dust scraping over stone. On that forgotten world lived a girl who was not quite a child and not yet an adult, an alien with silver eyes and pale skin that shimmered faintly under the light of two suns. Her name had been spoken once by her parents when they placed her in the safety of a cave and promised they would return. She had repeated that promise to herself every morning when she woke and every night before she slept. Years passed and still she waited. At first the days were full of hope. She gathered food from the strange purple shrubs that grew along the cliffs, fetched water from the shallow pools left after the rare rains, and kept her parents' camp ready for their return. She believed each sunrise might be the day their ship would appear in the sky. But as the seasons turned and her reflection grew older in the still waters, the hope became heavier. She counted the stars at night, whispering to them as if they carried her words into the blackness where her parents had gone. She carved marks into the stone walls of her cave, one for each cycle of the moons until the walls were crowded with memories of waiting. Loneliness became her companion. She invented voices to answer her questions and shadows to keep her company. Sometimes she spoke to the bones of small animals that she buried carefully under piles of stones. She pretended they were family, that they listened and cared. But deep inside she knew they were only echoes. Hunger often gnawed at her, and thirst drove her to wander farther from the camp. She learned which plants burned the tongue and which kept her alive. She learned which creatures to run from and which to chase with her sharp stone spear. Her body grew lean and strong, but her heart remained fragile with longing. Every time the sky shook with thunder, she looked up, hoping it was an engine, a vessel returning for her. When meteors streaked across the darkness, she chased after them until exhaustion dragged her down. She dreamed of her parents' faces, always the same gentle smiles, always reaching out for her. But when she woke, she found only the cave walls and her own hands reaching for nothing. One day she found an old beacon buried in the sand. It had belonged to her family once, though time had cracked it and covered it with dust. She cleaned it carefully, almost lovingly, and placed it at the entrance of her cave. She pressed its broken button over and over, though it did not light, imagining that somewhere in the far heavens the signal still shined and her parents still searched for it. She built a small pile of stones beneath it like an altar, praying with words she half remembered from her people's teachings. As more years dragged on, she began to fear her parents were gone forever. Yet she refused to leave the planet, for leaving meant betraying the promise that they would find her where they left her. So she endured storms, loneliness, and hunger, a fragile figure standing against an endless silence. In her heart she carried two truths: pain that her parents might never return, and hope that if she gave up, they would be lost forever. The galaxy beyond her small world had forgotten the girl, but she had not forgotten herself. She told herself stories of survival, stories where she would endure until the day someone found her. What she did not know was that far away, fate was already moving, and soon the sky would split open, not with the faces of her parents, but with someone entirely different. Someone who would change everything she thought she knew about waiting and about what it meant to be found. The human's arrival at Kapogur. Sky changed on a day that began like all the others, with the girl waking alone in her cave and whispering her parents' names as she had done every morning. The wind carried the scent of dust and the air was heavy with heat, but then a sound unlike thunder echoed across the cliffs. She looked up and saw a streak of fire breaking the sky apart. It was not a falling star, for she had seen those before, and they burned quick and vanished. This one roared louder and closer until it slammed into the desert plain beyond the hills. The ground trembled and birds of strange shapes scattered into the air. Fear told her to hide, but hope pushed her forward. Perhaps it was her parents at last returning in their ship. Her legs carried her fast across the dry ground until she reached the smoking crater. There she saw twisted metal and flames licking the edges of a broken vessel. She waited at the rim, holding her breath, afraid to climb closer yet unable to walk away. Then movement stirred within the wreckage, and from the smoke stepped a figure she had never seen before. He was taller than she expected, with rough clothing torn by fire and eyes that shone like the sea in her old dreams. His face was scarred with dirt and blood, but his steps were steady as he pulled himself free from the wreck. She had never seen a human before. She had only heard rumors from stories told by her parents, of a race from a distant world who were fierce and unpredictable. For a moment she thought he was some spirit born from the flames, yet his heavy breath and the way he stumbled forward showed he was real and alive. The girl raised her stone spear, though her hands shook. The human saw her and stopped, lifting his empty hands into the air in a gesture she did not know but somehow understood as peace. His voice carried strange sounds that did not match her language. Still, the tone was soft, not harsh, and when he spoke again, she heard kindness even without knowing the words. She lowered the spear but did not drop her guard. The human pointed back at the burning ship and then at himself as if to say he had fallen from the sky. She nodded slowly, her silver eyes fixed on him, and for the first time in years she felt her heart beating not from loneliness, but from the shock of meeting another living soul. The human tried to walk, but stumbled on the jagged rocks. Without thinking, she rushed to steady him, and he leaned on her shoulder with a weight that almost bent her to the ground. Together they moved back toward her cave while the wreck behind them continued to burn. She offered him water from the pool she guarded so carefully, and though he grimaced at the bitter taste, he drank deeply. She gave him roots she had gathered, and he ate them slowly, watching her with gratitude in his tired eyes. That night she sat near the fire while he rested against the stone wall. The cave that had always felt so wide and empty now seemed smaller yet warmer. She studied him in silence, noting the scars on his hands and the strange devices strapped to his belt. He carried himself with strength even in weakness, and she wondered what kind of world had shaped him. When he opened his eyes and caught her staring, he smiled faintly, and something inside her chest stirred like a memory she had almost forgotten. She still did not know if she should trust him, but she could not deny that his arrival had shattered the endless rhythm of her lonely life. For years she had waited for her parents, for anyone at all, and now someone had come, though not the one she expected. The human's presence was like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples across her soul. She did not yet know what his coming would mean, but she felt the promise of change carried in the sound of his breathing beside her. For the first time since her parents left, she was not alone, and that truth echoed in her mind as she drifted into uneasy sleep beneath the starlit sky. Building trust when the sun rose again, the girl found the human already awake and standing near the cave entrance. His clothing was torn, but he had cleaned himself with water from the pool, and now he examined the broken beacon she had placed on the stones long ago. His hands moved with careful skill as he studied the device, turning it over and brushing away dust that she had never thought to remove. She watched silently from the shadows, unsure if she should feel anger at him touching something sacred or hope that he might know how to make it work. The human looked back at her and spoke words she could not understand, but his eyes carried no threat. He pointed at the beacon and then at the sky, and she realized he was asking if it called others. She nodded slowly and showed him the button she had pressed countless times, though it never answered. He frowned in thought, then shook his head as if to say it was beyond repair. Yet instead of leaving it broken, he began to take it apart with tools from his belt, revealing wires and crystals that she had never seen before. Through gestures and patient sounds, he tried to teach her what he was doing. She struggled to follow, but his patience softened her fear. When the day grew hot, they rested in the shade together. He pulled strange dried food from a small pouch and shared it with her, though he had little left for himself. She tasted the sharp flavor and coughed, but ate it anyway, for the gift meant more than the food itself. As the days passed, he began to show her ways she had never known. He sharpened her stone spear to a finer point, tied it with strips of cloth from his damaged uniform, and demonstrated how to hold it steady. He built snares from wires taken from the wreckage, and soon they caught creatures she had always chased without success. He fixed the cracks in the water jar she had carried for years, sealing them with melted resin until it held strong again. She had survived alone with only her will, but with him, the struggle seemed less heavy. At night he drew shapes in the dirt, stars and paths between them, pointing to the sky and tracing lines that made constellations she had never seen. She understood only part of his meaning, yet felt his desire to share his world with her. In return, she told him stories of her parents, speaking slowly and pointing to carvings on the cave wall. He listened without interrupting, his eyes steady, and though he could not understand the words, he seemed to grasp the sorrow behind them. One evening when the fire burned low, she showed him the place where she carved marks for each cycle of the moons. The wall was crowded with lines that told of her endless wait. He placed his hand gently over the most recent mark, and then placed his other hand on his chest, a silent promise that she was not waiting alone anymore. The gesture brought a warmth to her eyes that she had not felt in years, and she turned quickly so he would not see the tears. Though they still struggled to speak the same language, their bond grew in actions. He protected her when storms swept across the desert, holding her close in the dark while the winds howled. She guided him to the safest pools when his thirst was greatest. They learned to move as one, her silver eyes always searching for danger, his steady strength ready to stand against it. The girl began to dream not only of her parents returning, but of a life where she did not wake to silence. She dreamed of laughter, of stories told by firelight, of someone beside her when the long night stretched across the land. She did not yet know the meaning of the word family beyond blood, but she felt that meaning, changing with every day the human remained, far, away beyond the broken skies. Others in the galaxy still believed this world forgotten and unworthy, but within its barren valley something rare had begun to grow. Two souls from distant worlds had found each other, and though fear and sorrow still lingered, trust was taking root like a fragile seed pushing through stone. Neither the girl nor the human knew where it would lead, but both had begun to believe that perhaps they were no longer just survivors. Perhaps they were something more. Shadows of the past. The days of survival turned into weeks, and the girl began to see the human not as a stranger from the sky, but as a part of her world. He had patched what could be saved from his broken vessel, and turned the wreck into a place where tools and supplies were stored. Each night they returned to the cave, and each morning they walked out together to search for food or water. Life had become less lonely, but deep within her there still lived a question that refused to sleep. She wanted to know why her parents had never come back and where they had gone. One evening while the human searched, through the shattered panels of his ship, he uncovered a small device that glowed faintly when touched. She leaned close, her eyes reflecting the light, and for the first time in years she saw symbols she recognized. It was not from his vessel, but from hers, from the same technology her parents had carried when they left. Her hand shook as she traced the markings, and the human noticed her reaction. He pressed a button and the device sparked, projecting a broken message into the air. The sound was garbled, words cut into fragments, but she recognized her mother's voice hidden within the static. The message spoke of danger, betrayal, and orders to flee from enemies who would stop at nothing. The image of her father appeared for only a breath, his face strained as he urged her to stay hidden and wait for their return. Then the message collapsed into silence. She dropped to her knees, clutching the device as if it were her parents' hands. For years she had imagined they had forgotten her, yet now she saw they had been taken by a storm of war greater than she understood. The human knelt beside her, his rough hand resting lightly on her shoulder. He did not know the words, but he saw the pain in her eyes. She tried to explain through gestures, pointing to herself, then to the fading image, then spreading her arms wide as if to show the vast galaxy that had swallowed them. He nodded slowly, and his eyes hardened with the look of someone who understood loss. Together they began to search the ruins scattered across the valley. She had always avoided the old structures built by her people, fearing the ghosts of memory. But with him at her side she dared to enter. They found carved walls covered with patterns of stars, maps leading to places she had never been. They found codes etched into metal tablets, warnings of factions that hunted her family. Piece by piece a picture formed, a picture of betrayal not by fate but by living enemies. At night, as they sat by the fire, she spoke more than ever before. She told him of her people's pride, of the council that once ruled them, of the whispers that her parents had challenged powers too great. The human listened with steady patience, and when she faltered, he placed a hand over his heart as if to tell her that truth mattered, and that he believed her. The girl began to realize that the silence of the planet had not been her prison alone. It was also a grave for secrets buried long ago. She was not simply abandoned, but hidden, kept away from eyes that sought to end her bloodline. The beacon she had guarded so faithfully was not a promise of rescue, but a marker of danger. The enemies who hunted her family could one day return to erase what remained. When she looked at the human, she wondered why fate had sent him here. Was he only a wanderer cast down by chance, or was there purpose in the fire that had brought him to her world? She did not know, but she began to believe that his presence was no accident. In his strength she saw protection. In his eyes she saw a promise that he would not leave her to the same silence her parents had. As the firelight flickered across the cave walls filled with her carved marks, the girl felt the past pressing close around her. Shadows of betrayal and sorrow stretched long, but beside her sat someone who was not afraid of shadows. The human might not know the depth of the story yet, but he was ready to face whatever truths the galaxy would reveal. For the first time she felt not only the weight of waiting, but the spark of destiny beginning to stir. And though fear whispered in her mind, a stronger voice whispered of hope. The enemy arrives. The winds had shifted, and with them came a new unease. The girl and the human had grown used to the rhythm of the planet, to the silence broken only by storms and the cries of strange creatures. But one night the silence broke in a way that was different. The sky lit with fire, not from falling stars, but from ships descending with sharp edges that caught the moonlight. She felt her heart seize because she knew these were not her parents, and the human reached for his weapon with the grim certainty of someone who had seen war before. The ships landed in the valley where her people's ruins lay. From their hulls marched figures wrapped in dark armor, their movements sharp and precise, their banners marked with the same crest she had seen in the old messages. They were the ones who had hunted her family, the reason her parents had never returned. She trembled as she watched from the ridge above, her silver eyes wide, the memories of her mother's warning now alive before her. The human placed his hand on her arm, steadying her, and shook his head slowly. He pointed toward the cave, urging her to remain hidden, but she pulled away and shook her head in defiance. For too many years she had waited, powerless and silent, and now the enemy had come to finish what they had begun. She could not turn away, though her hands shook as she gripped the spear he had sharpened for her. The enemy moved with purpose, scanning the ruins, searching for signs of life. They spoke in harsh voices that carried across the wind. She understood enough of their words to know they were looking for her, the last remnant of her line, the child they had failed to erase. Fear ran cold through her blood. But beside her the human stood unshaken, his eyes narrow with the fire of defiance. He had fought battles before. She could see it in the scars across his hands, and now he would fight again, not for himself but for her. They retreated to the cave to prepare. The human pulled apart his remaining supplies, fashioning traps from wires, shaping blades from broken metal, and teaching her quickly how to use them. She watched his hands move with skill born of experience, and though fear threatened to crush her, she drew strength from his calm. He showed her how to set snares at the cave entrance, how to throw stones to draw attention away, how to strike only when survival demanded it. As night fell, the enemy spread across the desert. Torches lit their path as they closed in on the hills. The girl crouched beside the human, her breath fast, her spear gripped so tightly that her hands ached. She whispered her parents' names like a prayer, and for the first time in many years she did not feel alone in the prayer. The human's presence was like a wall beside her, unbreakable and steady, and when he looked at her with those ocean-colored eyes, she felt the courage to face what came. The first intruder stepped too close, and the trap snapped, dragging him down into the dust with a cry. The others turned sharply, weapons drawn, and the human sprang from the shadows with a roar that shook her to the core. He fought not with elegance but with raw determination, striking fast and hard, turning the ruins of his wreck into weapons in his hands. She joined him, thrusting her spear into the ground near their feet, forcing them back, her fear now burning into something fiercer. For every enemy that fell, more came from the shadows, their numbers far greater than she imagined. Yet the human did not retreat. He stood firm, his body a shield between her and the blades that sought her life. His defiance seemed to burn brighter than the torches, and the enemy began to falter, murmuring among themselves about this creature they had never faced before. To them, humans were only myths whispered in the halls of power, but now they saw the truth of one standing against an army with nothing but will and fury. The battle raged through the night, and though exhaustion bit at her bones, she refused to yield. Together they drove the enemy back step by step until the valley itself seemed to tremble with the clash. The girl realized then that her parents' fate had been sealed by these very foes, and now she stood where they once stood, not as a child waiting, but as a warrior choosing to fight. And beside her was the human who refused to let her face it alone, humanity's defiance. The valley burned with the light of battle, and the night was filled with cries of anger and fear. The girl had never seen such chaos, yet in the heart of it stood the human, moving like a force born from storms. His weapon was only a piece of wreckage sharpened to a deadly edge, yet in his hands it became more dangerous than the advanced blades of the armored soldiers. He fought not for conquest but for survival and for her, and every strike carried a fury that none of the enemy could withstand for long. She moved beside him, her body trembling with exhaustion, but her spirit fueled by something new. Fear no longer controlled her limbs. Instead, she felt the rise of strength that came from knowing she was no longer alone. She thrust her spear with precision taught by his guidance, striking at weak points he had shown her, and each time she saw the enemy fall, she felt the weight of years of waiting lifting from her shoulders. The child who had carved lonely marks into cave walls was gone, replaced by someone who stood in the fire of war with her head unbowed. The enemy regrouped, shouting orders in their harsh language, calling for reinforcements. More shadows spilled from the ships, their armor gleaming under the twin moons. The human wiped blood from his brow and glanced at her, and in his eyes she read not despair but determination. He had faced worse before. She could sense it in the scars across his body, scars that told stories of battles far beyond her world. He nodded once as if to say that no matter how many came, they would not take her. They retreated toward the ruins, using the narrow passages between fallen stones to hold the enemy back. The human planted traps quickly, wires strung between pillars, shards of metal buried in the sand. When soldiers rushed forward, they fell into his snares, their armor torn and their formation broken. She watched with awe as he turned every piece of the land into a weapon, his mind sharper than the blades that swung at him. It was not strength alone that held the line, it was cunning and an unyielding spirit. In the heat of the clash, something stirred within her as well. The old carvings in the ruins seemed to glow faintly under the firelight, symbols of her people's heritage, and she felt a connection awaken deep inside. Memories not her own flooded her thoughts. Voices of ancestors who had stood against oppressors long before she was born. The knowledge came like instinct, guiding her hands to move with greater precision, urging her to call upon the strength that ran in her blood. She fought with a rhythm she had never known, her spear dancing with purpose, and the enemy began to fear not just the human, but the girl they had hunted for so long. Together they pushed forward, striking as one. When he swung, she followed. When she fell back, he covered her. The bond between them was no longer fragile but forged in fire, and the enemy could not break it. The human's defiance was like a storm crashing against the cliffs, unrelenting, impossible to silence. The girl's rising strength was like a flame that refused to die, growing brighter with every moment. Whispers spread among the soldiers, whispers that the human was not mortal but something more, a force of vengeance sent by the stars. Their leaders shouted to drown the fear, but doubt had already taken root. For the first time they began to hesitate, their blades slower, their steps uncertain. The girl saw it, and her voice rose in a cry that echoed through the valley, a cry not of despair but of defiance. The battle stretched until dawn painted the horizon with pale light. The survivors of the enemy pulled back toward their ships, dragging their wounded, their once proud march now broken. The human stood tall, though his body bore cuts and bruises. His chest rose and fell with heavy breath, but his eyes remained fierce. The girl stood beside him, her spear bloodied, her silver eyes blazing with the strength of one who had found her purpose. They had not defeated the enemy entirely, but they had shown them something they did not expect. A human and an abandoned child of a forgotten race had stood together and turned back the tide. The enemy had come to erase the last trace of her bloodline, but instead they left with the memory of humanity's defiance burned into their hearts. The girl knew they would return with greater force, but she also knew they would never see her as prey again. She and the human were no longer survivors, hidden in silence. They were fighters, and the galaxy would soon feel the weight of what that meant. A new beginning. The morning after the battle was silent again, but the silence was no longer the emptiness that had haunted the girl for so many years. It was the silence that followed struggle, the silence of survival, heavy with smoke and the faint scent of scorched metal. The valley bore scars of fire and broken armor, and the ships of the enemy had lifted away, leaving behind only wreckage and shadows. She stood on the ridge with her spear planted in the earth, her body aching but her spirit stronger than ever before. The human walked beside her, limping slightly from his wounds yet refusing to show weakness. He carried himself as he had during the battle, steady and fierce, and when he looked at her his eyes carried pride. She realized then that he had not only fought for her survival, he had fought for her right to live without fear. For the first time she felt the truth of what her parents had once told her. That family was not only blood but also the bonds forged in loyalty and sacrifice. They returned to the cave, the place where her years of waiting had been carved into stone. The marks on the walls seemed different now, No longer symbols of endless loneliness, but reminders of the journey that had led her here. She touched the newest mark and then turned to the human, placing her hand over his. Together they pressed it into the stone, a single mark that did not speak of waiting but of survival, a promise that from now on the days would be counted together. Days passed as they repaired what they could from the wreckage and gathered supplies from the battlefield. The human worked tirelessly, teaching her more of his skills, showing her how to mend armor, how to build tools from scraps, how to read the faint signals of the sky. She in turn guided him through the land, teaching him which plants healed wounds and which paths led to hidden water. They were no longer teacher and student but partners, each giving strength where the other lacked. Yet the girl knew the enemy would not forget. Their retreat had not been surrender but a pause, and they would return with greater force. Fear might have once broken her, but now she felt only resolve. She looked at the human and saw in him a spirit that had no equal. He was not of her blood, not of her people, but his courage had given her a future. She no longer dreamed of her parents' return, for she understood they were gone, but their promise had not been broken. It had been transformed. She had waited for years for someone to find her, and now she had been found by someone she never expected. One evening, as the sun sank behind the cliffs, the girl asked with gestures if he would leave when his ship was rebuilt. The thought tightened her chest with dread, for the idea of the silence returning was unbearable. The human paused, watching the firelight flicker across her silver eyes, then he shook his head slowly. He pointed first to her, then to himself, then to the stars above. She understood the meaning clearly. Wherever he went, she would go, and wherever she chose to stay, he would remain. Tears filled her eyes, but they were not the tears of sorrow she had shed so many times before. They were tears of release, the breaking of chains that had bound her heart for too long. She reached out and clasped his hand, and in that moment the cave that had been her prison became a home. The universe had stolen her family, but had given her another, forged not by chance but by fire and defiance. When the next dawn rose, they stood side by side, gazing at the horizon where the sky stretched wide and endless. Beyond that horizon lay enemies, mysteries, and dangers, but also hope and a future waiting to be claimed. She no longer felt like a forgotten child waiting for ghosts. She was a survivor, a fighter, and now a traveler with a companion who would never let her stand alone again. The human had changed everything, not only for her but for the story of her people. The galaxy would remember that on a forgotten world, an abandoned girl and a lone human had stood against an army and refused to yield. The whispers had already begun among the enemy, whispers of humanity's fire and the defiance that no weapon could crush. Those whispers would spread, and one day the galaxy itself would tremble at the thought of what humans could become when they chose to fight not only for themselves but for those they loved. The girl raised her eyes to the sky and felt the weight of waiting fall away forever. The past would always remain carved in stone, but the future stretched wide before her, and this time she would not face it alone. The humans stepped forward with her, their shadows stretching across the sand as the light of the new day crowned them. Together they walked toward the horizon where destiny waited, leaving behind the silence that had once defined her life. And so the story of the lonely child ended, and the story of a new beginning began, carried on by two souls from distant worlds who had found each other against all odds, the legacy of fire. The world that had once been only silence now carried the echo of something greater. The girl who had waited alone through countless nights no longer stood as a forgotten shadow. She stood as a survivor with her head lifted high, her silver eyes burning with the strength of memory and the promise of tomorrow. Beside her stood the human, a figure who had come from fire and ruin yet given her more than she had ever dreamed. Together they had faced the storm, and together they had refused to bow. The land bore scars of the battle, blackened stone and broken metal, but within those scars new meaning was born. The girl traced her hands over the ruined walls of her people, and felt not grief alone but pride. The blood of her parents had not been wasted, for through her survival their line continued. The human had shown her that survival was not enough, that life meant rising to fight even when hope seemed lost. In his courage she found her own, and in her resilience he found purpose. Each night they looked to the sky where stars glittered like distant fires. For her those stars had once been symbols of longing, lights she whispered to in desperation. Now they were beacons of a path ahead, a reminder that the universe was vast but not unreachable, For the human, they were reminders of his own kind scattered among them, a people who carried the same defiance he had carried into battle. The girl understood then that humans were not like other species. They did not surrender to silence. They did not vanish quietly. They rose again and again until the universe itself took notice. She knew the enemy would return one day. Their pride would not allow defeat to stand unchallenged. But when that day came, she would not be the frightened child who carved lonely marks into stone. She would be a warrior with her spear in hand and her spirit unbroken, and by her side would be the human who had turned her waiting into living, who had turned her sorrow into fire. Together they would not only face the storm, they would become the storm, and the galaxy would learn that some bonds could never be broken. The cave that had once been a prison of memories became their shelter of strength. The walls still held the marks of years spent in loneliness, but now those marks were joined by new ones, symbols carved together that told of unity. Each mark was not a tally of days lost, but a record of victories and promises kept. In the language of her people, those carvings spoke of endurance, and in the silent gaze of the human, they spoke of loyalty. When dawn broke across the valley and painted the sands in gold, they stepped forward side by side. The world stretched wide before them, filled with danger and hope alike. The girl no longer waited for a ship that would never return. She no longer prayed to the stars for voices that had long faded. She walked forward into the future, carrying the strength of her past and the courage of her companion. The galaxy had tried to erase her, but she lived. The galaxy had tried to break the human, but he stood unyielding. Together they were more than survivors. They were a promise that the forgotten could rise, that the hunted could endure, and that even in the darkest silence the fire of defiance would never die. Their shadows lengthened in the rising light as they walked toward the horizon. Two figures bound by destiny, two hearts beating against the silence of the universe. Where once there had been only waiting, now there was life. Where once there had been sorrow, now there was hope. The story that began with loss ended with strength, and the galaxy itself would one day remember the day an alien girl and a human stood together and changed everything. The end.